Oh my, this is laggy as hell. Granted, the SGI O2 workstations were never overperformers, but this one here features the 180 MHz CPU without any secondary cache, so it's the slowest of them all. I wonder how this 200 MHz CPU with secondary cache stacks up and if it can deliver some additional punch.
Oh, what's that? A page fault? I'm the Vintage Collector and these are my stories.
I just wanted to mention that Ian of SGI Depot made some benchmarks already over 10 years ago, so what you gonna add?
Don't worry, Ian did a great job and there's no reason for me to repeat or disqualify his work. And to be honest, there's no question that a faster CPU is better than a slower CPU. But how much is the difference, especially when doing a rather small upgrade step? Here I have the CPU which came with that O2 workstation, an actual MIPS R5000 at 180 MHz, just featuring a 64 KB of primary L1 cache, but not having any L2 secondary cache at all. And this is the replacement CPU, it as well being an R5K at 200 MHz, but bringing a whopping 1 MB L2 secondary cache. In the PC world, the impact of the CPU cache can easily be simulated with a 486. Take a 486 running at 66 MHz and disable the cache in the BIOS and let it run against a slower 486, like a 25 MHz model, with the cache enabled. The 25 MHz CPU will easily outperform the 66 MHz CPU in all areas, even if it runs at a lower clock. But there's no need to artificially prove the impact of the cache, as Intel themselves displays them when they introduced the Intel Celeron in April 1998. The first generation, the Covington, had only 32 KB of L1 cache and no L2 cache either, so was slow as hell. Only the Mendocino Celeron, which came in August the same year, brought a 128 KB L2 cache, which greatly upped the performance specs of the Celeron. Now, the R5000 MIPS line of CPUs was introduced in January 1996, and its next closest competitor in the Intel world was the Pentium Pro that just launched in November 1995. It's hard and unfair to directly compare the two CPU architectures, as the Intel CPUs are CISC-type CPUs, so using the complex instruction set, whereas the MIPS line of CPUs are of RISC type, so reduced instruction set. But let's put the CPU caches into perspective. The first Pentium Pro at the time, the 150 MHz model, featured already a 256 KB L2 cache, besides an 8 KB L1 cache. Let's put that into perspective with the 180 MHz R5000 PC that I have, which only came with the L1 but no L2 cache. Actually, SGI offered as well the 180 MHz R5000 SC CPU, which brought a 512 KB L2 cache and would be more on par with, let's say, the Pentium Pro specification. So one can definitely say that I have the cheapest entry-level CPU at hand, which was probably only there for a competitive entry-level price point, hoping that customers would actually go for the pricier CPU option. I expect to really see a difference once I plug in the higher spec 200 MHz CPU to my O2. But to compare, I need to do some benchmarks.
See? I knew it. Boring.
Alright, I got it already. I won't be going through all the madness, but just take some 3 more real-life oriented use cases. But first, I want to give a brief thank you to my episode sponsor for today, PCBWay. PCBWay is your definite source for PCB production and assembly services. But it doesn't end here. If you need CNC machining or 3D printing, their one-stop online ordering system makes your projects ready for production in no time. So far, PCBWay has been providing me with 3D printed parts for some of my restoration projects, including replacement parts for this very same O2 workstation as seen in detail in my last video. If you have any project ideas, use the link in the video description to check out PCBWay. New joiners will receive a one-time $5 welcome voucher. As a fact, my trigger was that when running Quake II on the O2, I noticed how laggy it was. It was pure coincidence that led me to finding the 200 MHz CPU, thinking it would be a worthwhile undertaking. Now it's worth mentioning that while preparing the test series, my O2 crashed out with a kernel fault when I tried running it at 1280 by 1024 screen resolution, which seemed to be reproducible. On the other hand, it didn't happen when running on any lower resolution. So I ended up running a sequence of tests on different resolutions, for the most using just the OpenGL acceleration, but also the software-only rendering. And as you can see here, I let it run in real time, and the game took a mere 80 seconds from startup until the demo was loaded. Now, this is the GL accelerated 640 by 480 full screen mode, and you can clearly see that in some of the more demanding areas, how everything, including the audio, is slowed down. The demo ran for 87 seconds through 689 frames for a 7.9 frames per second average. In 800 by 600 mode, we see it already decreasing, running 101 seconds and averaging to 6.7 frames per second. Needless to say that on the 1024 by 768 it got even worse and down to 5.7 FPS. And here we finally get the 640 by 480 software rendering mode, which not only gets out of sync very quickly as compared to the GL accelerated mode, but also comes with a drastic image quality reduction and delivers only a meager 4.5 FPS. But SGIs weren't actually meant for gaming, but were productivity machines, and besides many other things, it supported software emulation to run Windows by means of Insignia's SoftWindows95. Now, I had been venturing into this topic already in a previous installment, so I won't be going into the emulation topic, but just checking two things. First, how long would the installation take, which on the 180 MHz machine takes some 4 minutes and 12 seconds, whereas the software removal would take only 1 minute and 1 second. And how long would it take to just start up Windows 95 inside the emulation? That means from power up to showing the Windows desktop with all background tasks being completed. It takes roughly 107 seconds. But silicon graphics workstations were meant for image and video processing, animation work and things. So I took a short 22 seconds video in 320 by 240 resolution and converted it using the DM convert utility from uncompressed SGI video format into AVI, QuickTime, compressed SGI movie and MPEG-1 formats. And while it did quite okay on the first three, all completing in under 30 seconds, it was obviously lacking hardware assisted power for the MPEG-1 format, which took a staggering 14 minutes and 37 seconds to complete. Swapping the CPU is no big science. All you have to do is removing the system unit and then pulling the PCI cage. The CPU is secured using 2 screws that you need to unfasten before you can unplug the CPU board. Then you simply reseat the module and put everything back together in reverse order. And if all was done right, the machine should power up properly. And it does, and the new CPU shows up correctly in PROM. Yay, 1 MB of L2 cache. I'm really curious now. Let's start again by looking into Quake II, again running 640x480 in GL accelerator mode. While for the startup time we see a reduction from 18 to 14 seconds, which doesn't seem like much, it already feels a lot more snappy during the demo. Also, the frames and audio slowdown experienced before is now gone. All in all, the performance saw a 70% increase, with the demo taking only 51.1 seconds at an identical 689 frames as compared to the first run and averaging at 30.5 FPS. Obscure enough, when running in 800x600 mode, I ended up seeing this screen distortion. Still, the demo ran through, though here again some back pressure becomes noticeable in this more demanding segment with some audio skew. What is noticeable though, that while on the first run on the 180 MHz CPU, the 800x600 demo peaked at only 671 frames, while here we maxed out to 689 frames in overall. So no frames were dropped, while the demo took a bit longer to complete, 62.5 seconds and averaging to 11 FPS. Still this bloody screen distortion, why is that? I would need to rerun this to see if it is just some random hiccup or reproducible. Anyways, the 1024x768 in GL mode yields only 671 frames, so few frames were dropped actually. The runtime was 82.7 seconds, averaging for a rate of 8.1 FPS. It seems low, but is still an 80% increase from the original run. But what about the 640x418 software rendering mode? See by yourself, it doesn't do too bad actually, but there's again some noticeable audio skew. Back to the real world, the software installation would benefit from the faster CPU, bringing the runtime down to 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Also, the software removal benefited, coming down to 42 seconds. And for the Windows startup, we're down from a previous 107 seconds to now 85. The same is true for my video conversion tests, which yield some reduced processing times as well. And here comes a bonus entry. Already when performing the initial IRIX installation for this machine, I noticed that the built-in CD-ROM drive was not actually showing up on the PROM's install dialog. The one with the SCSI ID 4 you see here is an external drive that I hooked up to the external SCSI bus to allow me installing the system. This intrigued me, as in the PROM itself the internal drive would actually show up as ID 3 on the internal SCSI bus. Now, I thought about the defect, but actually when turning over to IRIX 6.5.30 for performing the required OS upgrade to get the OS support for the digital flat panel adapter for the 1600SW display, I used the internal drive to perform the upgrade. And guess what? It worked like a charm. What I did notice though was that the drive bezel was not sitting tight, but was quite shaky. And then it came over me all of a sudden. Could it be that? So following a strange thought, I was removing the shell so I could get access to the CD-ROM drive. Ha! I knew it! Look at this! This is not the original SGI CD-ROM drive found in this machine, but actually a CD rewriter. And you know what? That's actually the one I in fact installed myself to this very machine when the original drive broke while I was working at the Swiss web hosting company 23 years ago. How awesome is that? George did not just give me any random O2, but actually the O2 I sold him many years ago. My O2, the one I learned many things about Unix. Neither was he aware, nor was it intentional, nor did I notice it myself until just now. How awesome! I'm overwhelmed. Welcome home, my old friend. The many nights and night shifts we had together for operating our server farm, I still remember as if it were yesterday.
Now you see me smiling even more than before. So George, if you're watching this right now, I owe you. Can you imagine my feelings when I realized that this O2 down there is actually the one that I had as a daily driver on my first time employment back in 1999. It's unbelievable. And even more unbelievable is the difference it made just by swapping out the CPUs. The improvements seen here are far greater than one would expect from a simple step up from a 180 to a 200 MHz CPU.
And when taking into account the summary found here in SGI Depot, comparing a 180 versus a 200 MHz CPU, the performance difference is more like below 10%.
Now, why is that? The answer is simple. Ian tested and compared the 180 MHz CPU with the 512 KB L2 cache versus the 200 MHz CPU with a 1 MB L2 cache. Evaluating my results yields the conclusion that the huge improvement, no surprise, is owed to the benefit of the L2 cache, not found on my original CPU. How about you? Were you surprised about these results? Let me know in the comments below. So long, I'm the Vintage Collector and this was my story for today. Next video is due Sunday in a week. And if you can't wait, why don't you check out for any other of my videos on this channel. Thanks for watching and see you again next week.